Hey guys, welcome back. I'm super excited for today's episode. I know I always say that, but this one is truly, I find when I learned this stuff, I thought it was so freaking interesting. So I'm excited to share what I know about this topic. And it is the topic of essentially the collective psyche. And we're going to talk about like collective social programming, ancestral wounds and trauma, and collective masculine and feminine energy and what's going on there. So this is a bigger episode, but we've been spending a lot of time talking about how personal experiences, personal lived experiences affect you, your life, and the psyche. Now we're going to talk about what humans have experienced, what traumas your family might have experienced, and how that can be affecting you on a day-to-day basis, especially when it comes down to your career and your relationships. So we're going to start with generational or intergenerational trauma. This is the notion that trauma will get passed down to one's offspring. This can be from just a pure, psychological aspect, like beliefs and ideas get passed down, but there's also a biological component to this. So there are studies in epigenetics that show that biological markers definitely change our DNA structure with trauma. It can change how their body handles stress, and these changes are recorded in the DNA, which will affect how stressed that person feels and how they handle stressful situations. And those changes can be passed down to kids and grandkids. There's been studies like on Holocaust survivors, for example, that do show that certain stress or mental health disorders from the trauma did get passed down to children and grandchildren. Now, some of these events of intergenerational trauma can deeply influence a person's beliefs, their behaviors, and often we aren't fully aware of how our own intergenerational trauma or stories have affected our everyday lives. So if you had descendants that might have went through the Great Depression, might have experienced extreme poverty, there is a likelihood that there are belief systems around scarcity, around lack, around not having enough. And this could unconsciously shape your aversion to risk, for example. It can unconsciously shape how you freely spend or invest your money. It could lead to financial hoarding. And on the career front, you might be unconsciously avoiding any form of financial risk. So that might look like taking the stable job versus the lucrative job just to know that you're safe. Now, if your family had endured long-term oppression or discrimination, this can include Indigenous folks, Black folks, Jewish folks. There's this collective wound of mistrust. It's a collective wound about not feeling safe or having agency. You have to think that there's this collective memory that is being shared within that collective's unconscious of having their assets taken away, right? So this might lead to distrust of financial institutions. It could lead to a massive distrust of authority figures or government. And this distrust may negatively impact and influence the way that they invest and save their money. There is this collective memory of our land, our assets, our stuff was taken from us. They live with the trauma of usually suddenly losing everything very abruptly. So the survivors might instill in their children that nothing is forever, everything is temporary. It might also look like an aversion to risk and hoarding, or it might look like live for today, kind of like high risk mentalities. Basically, it's the trauma that the future is uncontrollable and unpredictable. And these beliefs and behaviors are generally absorbed. They're not specifically taught from one generation to the other. As children, the way that we actually interpret our environments is through emotion, is essentially through intuitive introception of emotion from the people around us. So a lot of this gets passed down at a very unconscious level. But at the end of the day, your psyche and your biology is trying to keep you safe. It's recording that information, right, to have it for future events. But however, you can see how holding on to some of these unconscious, ancestral, generational trauma belief patterns are incredibly unhelpful for your current day life. You can start uncovering your own intergenerational or ancestral patterns by just doing some thought work or some journaling around it. Really think of the stories of your ancestors. What did they have or not have? What traumas did they go through? Another one that we didn't really talk about is famine. So that's another one. It's what things did they not have? And how is that unconsciously showing up in your present day life? You might even see this in relationships. For example, there could be a history of domestic violence, addiction, broken homes or families. And when you start looking at the story of your ancestors, you will see a pattern emerge. So I really encourage you to really sit down and think about it. Ask the oldest person in your family to tell some of their stories and have them talk about the oldest generation that they remember. And you will, through inquiry, if you haven't done this already, you will start to see patterns form on what could possibly be the wounds in your personal, ancestral, collective unconscious. Now, there's also something that I'll say is more along the lines of societal wounds. And these are wounds and programs that have been inflicted based on things like patriarchy, systemic oppression, classism, racism, colonialism, okay, all the isms. All of these systems and structures have done things to the human psyche that are also something to be very aware of and to be introspective about. Now, there's a lot of talk about what does it mean to be a woman and what does it mean to be a man? So first, I'm going to explain masculine and feminine energy from a purely spiritual perspective, the yin and the yang, okay? And for the record, every human being has both of these energies within them and within their spirit. So yin, this is the energy of flow, feeling, dreaming, receptivity, intuition, spirituality, and it's the archetype of the moon. And the masculine yang energy is the doing, it's the structure, it's the thinking, it's the making, it's the action, it's the logic, it's the physical, right? And it is the archetype of the sun. Now, if we subscribe to just one or the other, right? If we're just all in our yin energy, we're just this kind of like watery nothingness, nothing's ever getting done. We're just existing, okay? And if you're totally in your masculine yang energy, it's like you are just like a little doer robot with no real connection to anything. So the key is you gotta have both. Now, the issue with a lot of these social structures today is that it's taking people's biological sex or the type of genitals that they have and subscribing them to a box, okay? Now, I'm going to acknowledge right here that there are biological differences between male bodies and female bodies in the form of hormones, chromosomes, right? Like there's a different biological structure. But what's interesting is that these biological differences, science has a really hard time on deciphering how it affects people's behavior when you take away society and cultural structures. It's basically almost impossible to separate biology from society. So let's just start open-minded here as I go through this, that gender identity doesn't have a lot to do with our biological sex and how we express ourselves in the form of masculine or feminine energy. But let's acknowledge that with our current cultural norms, that there are boxes that men and women get put into. And let's talk about those boxes real quick. So in the structure of patriarchy, we are seeing that women are put in the box of being emotional, submissive, nurturing, helpers, passive. And on the other hand, men are stoic, dominant, providers, doers, aggressive. Now, the world is changing and people are not fitting so neatly into these boxes anymore, okay? Men are committing suicide at alarming rates. And it's because they were never taught it was okay on how to express their emotions. because emotions go into the woman box, okay? And also let's just think about women who want to be providers for their family, right? There's a lot of roles that women excel in, right, from a cultural perspective, but they are devalued financially in our system. So these are roles like nurses, teachers, social workers. And it seems like men are looking for more equal partnerships with women instead of being solely pegged as the financial provider and nothing else. I'm personally seeing that there's a lot of men that are happy to be a provider, but also want to be more than that. And women like generally want to be in some of these more nurturing roles sometimes, but they're just not valued. And what's also interesting is that entrepreneurship is rising amongst women right now. You're seeing how everyone's not really neatly fitting into the boxes as much anymore. And if you look back on pre-patriarchal times too, like men have been known to be communal and nurturing, right? Like that's a human thing. That's not a woman thing. But these boxes are clearly dividing people. And it seems like in the media, there just seems to be more forces that seem to be dividing, right? Men and women, trying to put out more dogma about who we're supposed to be to each other. It's like, what are you bringing to the table? No, what are you bringing to the table? And it's like, can we just like have a meal at the table? Do we really need to be doing this? I think the key here is that we need to deeply understand the societal wounds that have happened from a generational perspective, from a masculine and feminine perspective, so that we can have true empathy for each other and reach across the aisle. Like we need to be patching each other up with kindness and understanding. Now, I'm going to talk next about the societal wounds of the masculine. And this is going to be geared towards cisgender men. I'm going to be talking about the societal wounds of the feminine. It's going to be geared more towards cisgendered women. And I'm also going to be talking about societal wounds of the queer. So if you do identify as non-binary or you identify as a different gender than the one you were born, you might relate to both sides of the masculine and feminine, and you're definitely probably going to relate to the wounds of the queer collective. I encourage everyone to deeply listen to all three of these categories, and with it, try to cultivate some empathy and think about how your fellow human being has been existing in this world. So I want to start with the masculine because I feel like sometimes men get left out of this conversation. It's always like the patriarchy is so bad to women and men are the perpetrators and women are the victims, when really the patriarchy is hurting everyone and it has a very negative effect on men. And let's talk about it. So I'm going to start with a little anecdote of when I used to be a dominatrix, okay? I created a program where I had various slaves that I had in my little stable, but essentially they were kind of like coaching clients. I would keep them on a self-improvement regimen for the most part. There'd be a couple like kinky tasks also in there, but for the most part, it was just providing direction and guidance and support to men who generally in their everyday lives were very much in control of everything, to the point where it was kind of exhausting. A lot of these men were like leaders in their field. I know this is like a stereotype, like, oh, it's always that like type A CEO that's getting whipped in a dungeon at night, but it's because there is so much pressure to be this perfect masculine archetype of our society, okay? And the problem with that is they also didn't really have a space where they could be vulnerable. Okay, so that's really what people hired me for. It was that so that they actually had a place to submit and be vulnerable and balance out that toxic patriarchal programming that had been telling them that that's who they have to be in the world 100% of the time. It was literally like a release session for a lot of my clients, and it was very healing and helpful for them. These men did have a deeper soul desire to express their softer side and to express their more vulnerable side. And many of them had serious repressed emotions and shame. I had some clients where we would role play some really dark stuff only to find out that that was an actual trauma that they had gone through. Through my dominatrix work, I was a safe space for men to come and express, for men to come and be vulnerable. And I learned so much. And also, not even through that work, I've always had this energy where men feel safe talking to me. I feel like I get the real story because I think men can tell that I'm not judgmental. And I've learned something quite interesting from the honesty of men. And it is most of them have gone through the same amount of physical or sexual abuse as women have, unfortunately. They just don't talk about it. And they don't have community. I'm getting a huge chill through my body when I'm saying this. They don't have community like women do, because women, we're allowed to get with our girlfriends and be close and have these close-knit circles with our girlfriends where we can talk about this stuff. Men are not encouraged to have male-on-male relationships and to have that emotional intimacy with other men for, again, pretty toxic reasons. Like, it's homophobia. It's you need to be strong. It's you don't express emotions. That's weak. And men, for this reason, are silently struggling. So ladies listening to this, please consider that a lot of the things that you have gone through, men have gone through too. Okay. The patriarchy also hurts men. And I also want to say, I know that there's a lot of like drama speak around patriarchy and capitalism and all this stuff. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a system of power and a set of beliefs that uphold that system, okay, that maybe really worked at a certain time in our human evolution, but it is having incredibly negative effects on people today. And we can't ignore it. And we can't get triggered. Men, this is speaking of men now, we can't get triggered when people are saying we need to change this and the patriarchy is bad, okay? And I think sometimes men take that as I'm bad. I must be bad. Everyone's mad at the patriarchy because it's run by men because I'm a man now. So I see also men get very defensive around this topic. And I'm really challenging everybody that's listening to keep an open mind as we're talking about these topics, okay? And really think objectively about what is going on in our societies and how it has programmed people and how it has ultimately hurt people. And we don't even have to label it, okay? But let's think about what can we do to move forward and what can we do to become better versions of ourselves and how can we improve society? There is this great concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, and that's essentially repairing the world. But if I had to summarize the massive gaping wound in the masculine collective right now, it is the wound of shame. Shame is insidious, and it's one of the worst wounds to the psyche that we can have as a human being. Because at the core, it's the feeling that who you are is unworthy, unlovable, and wrong. If you're told from the beginning of your life that your emotional experiences need to be hidden, that's essentially saying you need to be hidden. And it's in our biological code to need to be connected to other humans. So when you get the message that who you are will disconnect you from others and that you have to shut that down and shove it away, it's really, really tough on the psyche. And I feel like men really suffer from this at disproportionate amounts. And here's the thing, when shame is deeply buried, it leads to massive blind spots. It leads to lack of accountability. It can lead to aggression or anger. Again, it's a very insidious wound of the psyche. So people are like, oh, well, men are just more aggressive. It's like it's their biological makeup because of more testosterone. That is actually not true. But we probably think this, right? Because we see a lot of this like violence and aggression coming from men. But what if this violence and aggression is a direct correlation to this repressed wound of shame? I want to break this down into two wounds, I would call them. Not balloons, wounds. I don't know if anyone's watching on YouTube, this AI stuff where if you move your hands a certain way, it'll make little whatever animations on the screen. Anyways, is probably telling me to lighten up a little bit because I get real serious talking about these topics sometimes because I get very fired up about it. But let's just talk really quick about the brother wound, okay? And it's kind of like what we just talked about, but it's this idea that men aren't allowed to express their emotions. And it cuts them off from their peer relationships with other men. Having any sort of intimacy with fellow men, it can be considered feminine, gay, or weak. And it's just like, how does this make any sense? And who does it serve? This is actually a really good question. Who does it serve to ensure men don't have alliance with each other? You can't uprise against oppressive systems if all of the men can't even talk to each other in a vulnerable and honest way, right? I'm not trying to get all conspiracy theory about it, but it seems kind of manufactured. But even so, like, you can think about in our founding days, men built with each other. And when men are in their true power, they're innately concerned with the greater good of society, okay? People that are in their masculine power, they're all about like building systems and improving. And it's all about kind of the physical world that we live in, right? Going back to that masculine yang energy. But men that are in their true power, they're in connection with their emotion. They're in connection with others. And it seems like these days, the powers that be would prefer men to be just bodies for the war machine and not brothers. Which is going to bring me to the next wound here, which is the soldier wound. So male bodies are essential for wars. You have to think that at a societal level, they have been groomed to kill off other members of their species for a hierarchical power. And all I'm going to say about that is does that sound like that's healthy programming for human psychology? And how do you think that shapes the collective psyche of men? Really, at the end of the day, the future and the power of men, it really lies in them reclaiming their emotional side as human and necessary for growth and survival. It's about reclaiming some of these feminine or yin attributes that society told them was not okay to have, and understanding that we need both in both sexes, in both genders, to be able to be a fully balanced collective of people that are truly trying to help each other move to the next level. And some shadow work or thought work questions you can ask if you're a male identified person is, what is your experience on what it means to be a man? And what were you told by your family, your religious leaders, or your peers about what male traits are, okay? And what traits do you identify with and which ones do you reject? Get real clear on that. Also, what traits do you maybe find feminine that you do not express? And how do you view your own ability to care for others, to be in touch with your emotions, or to rest and go with the flow sometimes? And women, I want you to ask yourself this question. In what ways have you generalized male characteristics that may not be true? What nuance or compassion can you bring when you think about the experiences of men? And I know from experience, as a woman, I have dealt with a lot of trauma at the hands of men, and it is tough. It is very tough sometimes to have compassion for men when we kind of live in this patriarchal structure where they're quote unquote in control. But you need to think about, it's not the everyday man that's in control, okay? There is a system of power that, yes, is led by a few men, but it by no means trickles down to all men. And this also goes into what you put out is what you'll attract. If you constantly think that men are horrible and they suck, that's the mirror that's going to keep getting brought back to you. So I encourage women that have maybe some underlying resentment or animosity towards men during these times. I get it, okay? Try to find some nuance in what they could potentially be experiencing, because again, men suffer in silence a lot. And now we're on to the feminine. So this is really interesting, okay? In prehistoric and in ancient societies, they actually worship the feminine as God. The fact that women could create life in their bodies and birth souls, that was considered a closer incarnation to God as creator than men were. And then you start to see the rise of these patriarchal societies. And this is where you started seeing that monotheistic religions really came on the scene with this singular God, male authority figure that you were meant to follow. And this is a thing too, if you look into like social anthropology and stuff, it's really interesting how the religious component evolves with different societies, right? And what's going on in society at the time. It's truly fascinating. But yeah, there's tons of books on this topic, just from a social science perspective about how religion just like plays into these different eras and societies. But I digress. Anyways, so with the rise of these patriarchal societies, feminine traits became less valued, less important. Spirituality is now considered imagination. Receptivity is now considered weak. Women's reproductive biology is less godlike, and now it's kind of unclean and it needs to be controlled. Now women actually need to be chosen by a man to live in society under their rules and under their structure. So what do you think that could do to the collective consciousness of women? And I say that if I were to distill again what this is in one word, it's the wound of like invisibility. And this comes out in majorly different ways. You'll see on one end of the spectrum, some women might internalize this and make themselves smaller. Some actually might become servants to those around them and not listen to their true desires or needs and work to please or serve others first. And others will go in the opposite direction and try to become more visible by leaning more into very masculine traits and kind of pushing their way into these male-dominated spaces and molding themselves to be like really acceptable for these kind of patriarchal masculine rules, right? I did that. So this is where you see overly driven women become like these boss babes and smashing corporate ceilings just to prove themselves as worthy or to be seen, and completely denying their feminine energy, their feminine gifts, and their feminine traits. It almost swings into this like wounded masculine energy. Or you'll see that women will mold themselves into being the most sexually desirable for a man and in hopes that they will be chosen by a man. Because again, this has been our programming for quite some time. We could not survive as women unless a man chose us and took care of us financially. But these are all manifestations of the inner wound of not being seen, of not being valued. What's interesting, another thing I learned as a dominatrix is unconsciously, men still want to worship us at this very unconscious, because it's still in the collective unconscious, that memory of essentially worshiping the female deities. But under the system of patriarchy, this reverence, it's not allowed. And in fact, it's punished, which is tough. And this is why dominatrixes, there's such a good business for them, because it's still hardwired. It's still kind of coded in men's brains to worship the feminine and to revere the feminine. And so here's another thing that again is getting out of whack, because men aren't allowed to like revere a woman like that and really be in awe and honor of the feminine, because it's seen as weak or like you're simping, right? This is totally the patriarchal narrative, is that you would never, right, look up to a woman like that. And don't get me wrong, I know there's a lot of kings out there that respect feminine energy and freaking love it. So I'm not saying all men, but I'm saying that this is the programming, okay? But let's talk about a couple specific wounds that add to this. And the first one is called the witch wound. So you have to kind of go back in the day, women that were connected to nature, their intuition or spirituality, or maybe they were healers, they were considered witches. They were burned, they were hanged, they were raped. And here's the thing, when women are in their true power, when female bodies are in their true power and connected to the earth, magic happens. The connection to the great beyond and nature's mysteries are like more easily accessible. Our reproductive system is holy, but there's been years of persecution around these attributes that women have. And it's made us afraid of our own bodies and our powers and our gifts. And it's interesting because you can look, it's like feminine power under the patriarchy. It's seen as like scary and demonic and unbridled. And women have really internalized this. There is great power in the shadow of the feminine, but it takes a lot of introspection to unwind some of these belief systems that women have internalized. The other wound I want to talk about is what I would call the sister wound. And you have to think during this era, especially the witch trial era, which was happening all over the world, but women were encouraged to snitch on each other. Women were encouraged to snitch on each other, to save themselves. We were in a system of needing to be chosen by men, so there was naturally competitive energy against us and other women. It created this like sense of scarcity amongst us to where we were willing to backstab, lie on, step on in order to gain resources for survival. So essentially, women have been conditioned to not trust each other. And there was a lot of priority on supporting the nuclear family of like your husband and your children versus creating community amongst each other. So there is some disconnection amongst the sisterhood of women due to our societal programming. So I think for women, the key here is to reclaim authority. Also reclaim our spirituality and our intuition and our connection with each other and with nature. And also allowing ourselves to take on more masculine traits such as like confidence, organizing, doing, and leading while still honoring your feminine energy like resting and being in flow and sharing wisdom. And I do want to note that while we might lack community and sisterhood, we still have it a lot better than men and their brotherhood, as I said earlier. So be grateful for that, but we still need to strengthen it and work together better to embark on this next chapter of our societal development. And for women, you want to ask yourself the same questions. Like, what's your experience of being a woman? What were you told by your family, your religious leaders, and your peers about what feminine traits are? And which ones do you accept and which ones do you reject, or which ones trigger you? What aspects of yourself are you maybe keeping in the shadows? Aspects that are maybe more masculine, more logical? Like, how do you view your own ability to be assertive, action-oriented, or be a financial provider for yourself or for others? And for the men, think about ways that maybe you have unfairly generalized feminine characteristics that might not be true. And what nuance or compassion can you bring when you think about the experiences that women have been through? And I want to leave you guys with a couple books here. I meant to say it, but for the masculine, collective masculine trauma, there's some great books that you can read that really double clicks on everything that I'm saying. And one is called For the Love of Men by Liz Plank. And the other one is called Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. And they really delve into the social implications of what it means to be a man today and what conditioning has done to men and what they're struggling with right now, and the lack of equality that men face when it comes to women too. Like, for example, women are more likely to graduate college than men. And there's some real nuances about the way that our system is set up and how it's not benefiting men either. So definitely read those. And if you're interested more on the wounds of the feminine that I just talked about, there's a great book called When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. It's a great book that talks about gender roles and religion and what I was talking about regarding how ancient cultures actually had lots of feminine worship. And another great one is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Dr. Clarissa Estes. There's a couple books if you want to delve into it a little bit more. So now I want to talk about the societal wounds of, I'm just going to call it the queer. And I'm using this as an umbrella term as anyone that's operating outside of this binary, cisgender, heterosexual, quote unquote, majority, okay, in society. But being queer is as old as time. Ancient art and mythology proves this to be true. And in different eras or cultures, this was completely normal, accepted, and even celebrated. But in our current society that's so narrowly focused on categorizing people into two different boxes of that like cisgender heterosexual man and cisgender heterosexual woman, queer people are often left on the fringes of society. And I just want to say this. Being a rebel to the status quo is incredibly important to societal growth, but it is incredibly hard on the personal psyche. Queer people are often bearing the brunt of both sides, of both polarities of trauma and wounds of both the masculine and the feminine. But I would say that the collective wound of the queer, I would say, is it's the loss of connection to others and it's fear, but it's essentially the wound of rejection. And it also is the wound of shame. It's very similar, but also worse than what men are dealing with. It's a shame wound coupled with a rejection wound and a wound of like fear. And it can come across in a couple different ways where either it's kind of like self-victimization or anger. There's a lot of trauma that comes from the personal experience of someone living a queer life in this society. This wound is usually coupled with lots of this life trauma and lots of just societal trauma that has trickled down. It is scary and it's shameful to be queer in today's society. There are these political and these social narratives that being queer is evil, it's dirty, it's unnatural, it's wrong. And again, we're wired for connection. So when you feel that you've been pushed to the fringes and told your whole life that who you are is not just not accepted, but like perhaps evil and bad, and that there's nothing you can do to redeem yourself, that has such a negative effect on the personal psyche and the collective psyche. So you have to think, and I'm comparing it back to men because I said men are kind of living with this repressed shame, but queer folks usually can't hide who they are. It's much harder to repress your sexual desires, your inclination for a relationship and for love and for connection. So it's almost this experience of accepting the disconnection. And I don't even want to say accepting the disconnection. It's living with the disconnection, which is so against our human nature and so against what we truly desire. And I want to say specifically to people that have chosen the path of what feels right to them and authentic to them, whether that be choosing the right relationship that works for you, whether that be showing up in your gender identity in a way that feels true and authentic to you. All I'm going to say is thank you so much for your bravery, because it is important to do. And usually you will see that is how you can heal this wound, is that through truly stepping into your authenticity, no matter how much society says we don't like it, because you will on the other end find the people that love and accept you. And it is such a hard soul journey to have a path where you are going to be going against the societal grain of what people say on how you should be showing up, how you should be presenting, what it means to be in your body, what it means to love who you love. Like, these are really tough things for there to be discrimination against, because it is like literally who you are and how you're showing up in the world. And just know, if you are struggling with this in particular, I totally understand. And it's a process. It's a process of your own individuation and coming into your own identity. And my background too on this is that when I was in my 20s, I was a mentor for a transgender male. And, you know, I watched him go through all of these different iterations when he was really working this out for himself. And I know that journey is, one, different for everybody, but that it's also really hard. Another thing is, when I was doing my dominatrix work, I worked a lot with trans questioning folks or people that were trans and just weren't ready to come out with it. So I get it. I totally get it. But yeah, I will say the wound of the queer, of living a queer life, is one of the hardest paths. But yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is the key here is you need to face the shame head on. And I know it's scary. I really do. But you can't let it fester in your subconscious mind, because it brings out all kinds of nasty stuff like hate, rage, nihilism, suicidal tendencies, like lots of mental health issues. So please, yeah, the repression of oneself when you are queer it's a tough one. Even though you might experience more violence or disconnection, or like you're getting more pitchforks from society and you are truly being victimized, claiming the identity of a victim just isn't empowering. So reclaiming your power as a survivor, a rebel, and a soldier for future acceptance and tolerance for others is what you are here to do. That is your soul path. And queer folks that are listening to this, your experience is holy, and you need to see yourself for who you really are, which is a warrior. Couple questions you can ask yourself are, what are some of the hardest experiences that you've had being queer, and how have they impacted your personal narrative or story? Are you the hero of your own story, or are you the victim in your story? Also, it's important to do a lot of work around shame and understanding how shame has played a role in your life. And recall times in your life that you were made to feel less than, or insignificant, or dirty, or wrong, and how has it impacted you? You're really going to have to sit through these difficult experiences and feel them fully. And this could take time, but this is really the path that is taken to get to the other side of like freedom and happiness and joy. I also want to just add some questions to think about for the cisgender heterosexual folks that are listening. You know, what's the narrative in your family or your peer groups about people who have alternative preferences and their sexuality, relationships, or gender identity? Like, what did it inherently mean to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, or otherwise queer? And it's really important to interrogate things that your family said to you. I mean, we all grew up, especially like now it seems like everything's chill, but I know, okay, like in the 90s, like people were always making gay jokes. People were always making fun of like lesbians and trans people. And there was a lot of collective bullying that was happening. So that did affect your psyche in some way and could be driving some unconscious biases. So it's really clear to know what they are and to combat them. And same question, you know, in what ways have you generalized queer people that might not be true, and what nuance or compassion can you bring when you think of the experiences of being a queer person? A couple books I'll leave you with too if you want to dig in more of this. There's one called We Are Everywhere by Matthew Reimer and Leighton Brown, A Place for Us by Brandon Wolfe, and Queer Magic by Thomas Prower. All awesome books that I would highly suggest you read to get in touch with the narrative of what it means to be queer, the power behind being queer, and the spiritual connection to queerness. Now, I know I just went through all these ways and like how we're shanked and like pushed and molded by these societal pressures. And it's important to know. It's definitely important to know, to see it, to consider it. And there's times when you're going to do your shadow work around this that you're going to notice and you're going to find some icky beliefs that you had, and you're going to see ways that you fucked up, or maybe systems that you defended that now maybe you don't align with anymore. And that is okay. You know, some of the beliefs that we have aren't really ours, or maybe there was ignorance that you laid out publicly, or maybe there were ways that we treated people that we regret. And it's really important to not like self-flagellate, you know, and push ourselves into another shame cycle. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to update your beliefs. The ability to be mentally flexible and change your mind is actually a huge signifier of wisdom. If you don't update your beliefs regularly, you're not growing. The ability to admit that you are wrong about something shows incredible intelligence. It shows courage. It shows strength. It shows confidence. It starts with forgiving yourself versus staying small in your shame and your pride. We're not right all the time. We're human beings. We fuck up, we grow, we change. It's all part of the experience. Forgive the prior version of yourself. They were doing the best with the information that they had. There's another side of this that maybe you're going to sit and you're going to create some new perspectives for yourself. And as you update your identity and your belief system around maybe some of these structures or programming that you have, and you're going to get this like angry, passionate feeling. And that's also, that energy is great because you can propel that into actions that create change. It's also important though to check these impulses and ensure you're not entering into some kind of like martyrism or victimhood. Like putting all of your energy to sacrifice yourself for the quote unquote greater good doesn't actually help the greater good. If you only focus on what's wrong with society and all of the problems, that's good for no one. The real way that we impart change is that, it sounds so corny, but it's true. It's you become the change you want to see in the world. Okay. The more healing and updating you do to your programming and you're going out in the world that way, it by proxy ripples out to people. Okay. It's going to affect your family, your friends, your children, the barista you met at the coffee shop, like literally everyone. That is how we make collective change. And I'm not saying don't come up with some like cool creative ideas on maybe how to change a structure or affect a system that you are already in, but you have to come at it with this kind of energy of like optimism and excitement for the future. That's the energy that you want. Anyways, guys, that's it. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And I want to announce before we get going here is me and my friend. Her name is, actually, she was on the podcast, Allison Ziggy. So we had talked about this when we were traveling in Europe together last year after she had left her corporate job and I was working on my new business endeavors. And we knew, because we both kind of came from a corporate background, that we had a unique perspective on the things that go wrong when you're out of alignment with your job. Like, yeah, you can burn out, you can get fired, you can have a freaking meltdown like I did. But we have very different ways that we approach things with our clients. Like, I'm very much focused on the unconscious mind and like shadow work, whereas she's more focused on the unconscious mind through things like scripting and hypnosis. And she has a planner and calendar company. So she's really into just like goal setting and planning and things like that. Whereas I'm all about how do you take off your mask and walk into a more authentic life. We're coming at the same problem, but from these different ways on, because for her journey, it was all part of like standing in her empowerment was really about having the confidence in herself and building out this fallback plan with her business so that when she did get fired, she actually had something else to do, which was really empowering, especially in this world right now where people are just feeling like a cog in the machine that can get fired at any time. She has a really interesting perspective on how to be empowered in your career, or even if you want to stay in your corporate job. And I come at it from this, like, probably my death doula stuff. It's like, hey, let's get real straight and clear on your values. Let's start updating your identity and your mask so that you can live and be your true self. So I kind of come at it from this very transpersonal way. But yeah, so we are going to come together and we're creating this program right now. It's called Unlocking the Golden Handcuffs, and it's about transforming your career on your terms. I'm going to be announcing it on my social media and stuff, and I'm going to be talking about it and just kind of go over the challenges that we know people are facing right now and our approach to solving some of these problems. But I have never done a launch like this, and I'm doing it with someone who's just such a good friend of mine. And I don't know, I'm stoked. So this is me kind of like teasing it, I guess. I'm formally announcing it. We're going to be doing it in a few weeks. It's going to be the week of May 20th, and it's going to be from May 20th to the 23rd. It's going to be a 4-part series. But yeah, I'm so excited for it. But I wanted to let you guys know to keep an eye out for that. And if you want updates on that, just follow me on social media. You can join my email list. But yeah, I'm super excited to roll this out. So that's that. Other than that, again, thank you guys for joining, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Practically Awake. Please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and leave a rating wherever you're listening to your podcast or on YouTube. In the show notes, you'll find different ways to reach me, including how to follow me on social media. Thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next time.